I know that everyone and their dog, including us, are obsessed about this election in May of 2024, but let's look at the trends outside of politics. And the trends are South Africa is balkanizing at an accelerating rate.
Eskom, the much loved Eskom. We all love Eskom because they provide us with so much electricity in this country. Apparently, they need 390 billion to expand the grid. Now, by expanding the grid, maybe they'll be able to do something that they've never been able to do before. Provide us with electricity.
So this is hot on the news that a bill has just been through Parliament to say that the state is creating a transmission company. So Eskom's being broken into three. This is the transmission company. What does transmission do? It doesn't create electricity and it doesn't deliver electricity. All it does is it sends electricity across the transmission lines. This is what Eskom is trying to do right here, which is very, very important, because if you want to have any sort of independent power providers on the grid only goes from north to south. So you can't have a solar farm in the Karoo because it can't plug into the grid going northwards. It needs to increase transmission so that more independent power providers, let it be backyard nuclear reactors or solar panels, can be fed into the grid to provide electricity to the entire country. Why is this important? Looking for 400 billion rand from the private sector and foreign funding. Why? Because the South African state can't afford it. Why? Because we are bankrupt. So what's happening? Eskom and electricity is being privatized right before our eyes, and that is a very wonderful thing.
Yes, so for those of you who have wondered, how come with all the expansion in the solar and private sector generation and the green energy and all the other bullshit that we're told is being expanded in South Africa at such a rate, why do we still have load shedding? And the answer is because the grid can't actually accept that power into it. That is the reality. And the other thing is that the grid is kind of old, so it doesn't really know where the power came from. Now, if you wanted to put your own electricity back into the grid, how would the grid pay you? You wouldn't even know where the power came from. It's not that sophisticated. In many places around the country, I'm sure many of you will be able to comment in the comment section below. In some instances, they can't even turn your grid off with the power because the actual substations are so old, they're not even sure they can put it back on. So you don't actually experience load shedding. There are numerous places around the country where that is a reality. So what Eskom actually needs to do, now that it is splitting itself apart, is in order to create a grid that allows the state to generate power and supply it to the grid, and the private sector to generate power and supply it to the grid, what it needs to do is actually modernize the grid itself so that the grid is complicated and sophisticated enough to deal with it, and also to understand who gave us the electricity, how do we pay them? Because without that, let's face it, mate, no one's paying or giving their electricity to the grid for free. This is effectively going to be my cost to supply you with power, and I'm never going to get paid for it. Who's going to do that? The answer is no one.
So you can think of this as the transmission being the courier company. So you buy something online from a company and it gets delivered to your door. You pay the company, but the courier company transports that item to your particular house. That is what Eskom is going to be. It's not going to produce electricity. I mean, it will a little bit, but not enough to meet the demands. It's certainly not going to be exclusive electricity provider as it currently is meant to be. So therefore, it's just going to be a place where people are buying electricity and then Eskom is transmitting the electricity towards whoever buys it. So you can build a nuclear power station in your backyard, plug it into the grid. Eskom makes money if people buy that electricity from you because it's going to create that courier. It's going to be that transmission between you and your potential customers in time to come. This is going to cost 390 billion rand, which is very expensive, but they want to create 15,000 kilometers of transmission lines, which is more than they currently have and more than they have built in the previous 10 years. So it looks like we're finally figuring out what Eskom is doing. It's going to be the courier company for electricity based on private money.
But
excellent news.
Yes, but let us be clear that that is only in relation to the transmission or grid section of Eskom. Eskom will itself also have an actual production section of the actual company, if you want to call it that. And what the production company will do is it will basically create electricity and supply it to the grid itself. So what that means is that if they can provide the electricity to the grid at a cheaper cost than, say, the market can, then it does ultimately benefit the grid, because then we can have cheap electricity supplied to the grid. It means that you're not beholden purely to private sector influence, where the private sector may, according to some ANC members, inflate the cost of electricity and make it more expensive for the general public. So this is meant to mean that Eskom itself no longer has a monopoly on the generation of electricity. So the generation arm will be very separate to the grid arm. And together, what that's meant to mean is that the grid is able to act independently of generation. But it's only going to happen if you can actually make the grid sophisticated enough to take all the independent power stations and actually provide the electricity, right? I mean, it's not going to work unless you do that. And let's face it, what we're probably going to see is that there will still, in theory, probably be a desire, if you will, that the majority of the electricity bought will probably still come from Eskom. So it's still going to be interesting. It's still early days to see how the company will work. However, what it does mean is that if Eskom is unable to generate, then the pressure on them to be the sole point of generation will kind of slowly dissipate, and the private sector will be able to come in and provide what Eskom can't. That does obviously leave the obvious question, Ramon, and that is if the actual generation capacities, the coal fleets and Kuberg and whoever else, if they continue to deteriorate, how long until they just go, why do we even need to do this? The private sector do it. In which case, by doing that, you've basically fully, effectively privatized electricity.
Exactly. So, if Jacob Zuma becomes the premier or head honcho of KZN, and if the DA keeps the Western Cape, they can provide electricity to their own people on their own accord. Zuma can build a nuclear reactor from Russia, which he loves so much, in the middle of Nkandla, power the entire KZN from that. The DA can have solar panels on Table Mountain for all I care, because they don't like nuclear, because Russia bad, right? But what we're seeing here, once again, balkanization of South Africa. If the transmission lines works really, really well, anyone can plug into it and provide electricity for anyone else who's willing to pay. And that is the big news of today. Forget about the election a little bit. These things do affect what's going to happen. But what you can see right in front of you is a privatization of the South African state based on the competence of the state in and of itself. And that's a wonderful thing, irrespective who is president or minister of finance.
Yes, and I hear you say, ladies and gentlemen, why are you being so nice to Zuma on this? When we're saying, you should go out there and create some nuclear power stations. I want to leave you with a fact, ladies and gentlemen, and that is if Jacob Zuma had actually created that nuclear power station, we wouldn't have a load shedding. And electricity would actually be arguably a hell of a lot cheaper than it is now. And I need to basically inform you of how much that was going to cost us in rands. So in rands, it was going to cost us 760 billion rand, which at the time everybody told us it's impossible. Let us not forget that what we're basically saying is that Eskom needs half that money right now just for the grid. And the amount of money that the economy suffered as a result of not having Jacob Zuma's nuclear power station is far greater than any of the 700 billion ever was going to be. And that should get you thinking, was his nuclear deal really as bad as they said? You let us know in the comment section below.